the door. Because growing up in America, we hear about certain people and certain trends in history. And we say, well, that has to be the truth. You see? I mean, we come up to the Civil War and we say, well, the Civil War, it was over slavery. And Abraham Lincoln was killed by John Wilkes Booth, and that's just the way it was. And World War I was because an archduke by the name of Ferdinand got shot in Sarajevo, and that just started the war. You see? And World War II, as soon as you think of World War II, you think of one man's name. You think of Hitler immediately. And so when you pick up a book like The Secret Terrorist and you start reading, or as we go through these Behind the Door series, it's like being in a dark room for your whole life. You're in this room and there's no lights and it's totally dark. And then all of a sudden, somebody appears in the room and turns the light switch on. Now, can you imagine the agony that a person who has never seen light would go through? Being in a darkened room all their life, and somebody turns the light, they go, "What? Turn that thing off! Turn it off! It's hurting my eyes!" You see? That's what happens when people read a book like that. It absolutely stuns them. It stuns them. And so when my mom said, well, I'm reading the book and going through it again, it's like she's trying to assimilate the material. And it made me really glad to think that she was reading it, because it means that the light is creeping into the room slowly but surely. You see? And so some of these topics that we've looked at in Behind the Door have been very, very difficult to handle. But as the Jesuit young man said who read the book recently, everything in the book is absolutely true, and there's a whole lot more. A whole lot more. I want to start off the meeting this afternoon and go back to one of the most important conferences or congresses in the last couple of 100 years. This one took place in Vienna. It's called the Congress at Vienna. It took place in 1814 and 1815. At that Congress, of course, it was right after a little Frenchman had sought to go through Europe and devastate and take over that continent. Do you remember the little man's name? It was Napoleon. That's right. Napoleon Bonaparte was a French general. Napoleon Bonaparte was trained by the Jesuits on the island of Corsica. And the primary purpose of Napoleon Bonaparte was to go through and pay back all the Catholic emperors of Europe who had suppressed and expelled the Jesuit order from their countries. That is why, if as a Seventh-day Adventist and somebody who has looked at history, we have always taught, and rightly so, that Napoleon sent one of his generals. Now, Napoleon was Catholic, and his general, Berthier, was Catholic. Okay, they were both Catholic. Napoleon, a Catholic general, sent Berthier, a Catholic, into Italy to capture the Pope, who is what? Catholic. Now, would you explain that to me? Doesn't make any sense at all, does it? So why would a Catholic general send one of his Catholic men in to capture a Catholic Pope? Because 25 years before, the Pope had expelled by a bull the Jesuit order forever. You see? And so the Jesuit order raised up Napoleon Bonaparte to wipe out all of those Catholic countries that had suppressed the Jesuit order. That's why a Catholic general sent Catholic Berthier to capture a Catholic Pope. In the Congress at Vienna in 1814 and 1815, Pope Pius VII reestablished the Jesuit order. During that Congress, the Jesuit order and the leading emperors of Europe, who were all controlled by the Jesuits, they wanted to create, and this was in 1814, they wanted to create a League of Nations. Okay? That was in 1814. We're not talking about at the end of World War I. We're talking about after the Napoleonic Wars. They wanted to create a League of Nations. Well, there was one leader at the Congress of Vienna in 1814 and 1815 that said, I will have nothing to do with this League of Nations. That leader, his name was Tsar Alexander I of Russia. Well, because of the fact that the Jesuit order wanted to establish a League of Nations in 1814, Tsar Alexander I became a target of Rome. Because whenever somebody stops or halts or gets in the way of the papacy's plans for world dominion and the Jesuits' drive to aid in that takeover, that person becomes a marked man ready for destruction. So Alexander I had at least 2 strikes against him as he returned to Moscow around 1815. Alexander then did something even worse than that, because in 1816 he did something else. This is taken, and I'm going to be reading now from a book by Richard Thompson called Footprints of the Jesuits, pages 245 and 246, and it's found in this book, Vatican Assassins, on page 271. It says this: the Russian Emperor Alexander I was compelled to issue a royal decree in 1816 by which he expelled the Jesuits from St. Petersburg and Moscow. This proving ineffective, he issued another decree in 1820, excluding them entirely from the Russian dominions. Alexander set forth in his decree that he had entrusted them with the education of the youth, had imposed no restrictions upon their right to profess and practice their own religion, but they had abused the confidence which was placed in them. They had implanted a hard intolerance in the natures infatuated by them, and were directed merely to secure advantages for themselves, the extension of their power, where in fact Alexander I in Russia expelled the Jesuit order in 1820. Now, after the Napoleonic Wars, we can probably get an idea as to what happened to Alexander I, can't we? Guess what happened to Alexander I? He was killed. That's right. 5 years later, 1825, Alexander I was poisoned. You'll find that in a book called Russia in War and Peace by Alan Palmer. And he says, but in 1820, Alexander expelled the papal Caesar's militia of the Black Pope until they were formally readmitted by Lenin in 1922. For this, the Jesuits murdered him in 1825, slipping him the poison cup. So in 1825, Alexander I was poisoned to death. Why? Because he had expelled the Jesuits from Russia and had stood in their way of establishing a League of Nations at the Congress of Vienna in 1814 and 1815. Now, what else happened in Russia in the 19th century? You should look at something else here with me. Sometime after Alexander I, after he was killed, then I believe it was Nicholas I came into power. And then he died, this time a natural death. Nicholas I died a natural death. Then came into power one Alexander II, Tsar Alexander II. It's very interesting. He also incurred the wrath of the Jesuit order. What Alexander II did was twofold. Number one, during the Civil War, we find in Charles Chiniquy's book, 50 Years in the Church of Rome, that the Catholic Church, in order to annihilate the Union of Abraham Lincoln, what they did is the Jesuits controlled the South. They also gathered a very, very large army, a French army, in Mexico. The Jesuits also had England under Queen Victoria, who was a Jesuit agent. She was controlled by Rome. Queen Victoria sent a great army, an English army, into Canada. And what they were going to do, what the Jesuits were going to do through the Confederacy, through the French soldiers in Mexico, and through the English soldiers in Canada, they were going to all merge right on the north. And they were going to crush Abraham Lincoln and the Union Army. Well, two things happened that stopped that. Number one, Abraham Lincoln issued something called the Emancipation Proclamation. And when he issued that, the British Army in Canada, even though they were Jesuit-controlled, that army would not fight a nation that did not agree with slavery. So the Emancipation Proclamation stopped the English. But there was something else that stopped the English, the Confederacy, and the French. And it had to do with Alexander II. I want to read it to you. It's found in this book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, by G. Edward Griffin. It's on pages 377 and 378 of his book. It says this. Well, actually, here it is. It says, "And so it was that within a few months after the outbreak of war between the North and the South, France landed troops in Mexico. Negotiations were begun immediately to bring Mexico into the war on the side of the Confederacy. England moved her troops to the Canadian border in a show of strength." There you got it. America was facing what appeared to be a checkmate from the powers in Europe. It was a masterful move that possibly could have won the game had not an unexpected event tipped the scale against it. Tsar Alexander II, who incidentally had never allowed a central bank to be established in Russia, notified Abraham Lincoln that he stood ready to militarily align with the North. Although the Tsar had recently freed the slaves in his own country, his primary motive for coming to the aid of the Union undoubtedly had little to do with emancipating the slaves in the South. England and France had been maneuvering to break up the Russian Empire. Knowing that war was being considered by his enemies, Tsar Alexander decided to play a chess game of his own. In September of 1863, he dispatched his Baltic fleet of warships to Alexandria, Virginia, and his Asiatic fleet to San Francisco. The significance of this move was explained by Russian-born Karl Rakonewski. It says no treaty was signed between Russia and the U.S., but by the threat of war to both unified these two nations at this critical moment. By dispatching his Baltic fleet to the North American harbors, the Tsar changed his position from a defensive to an offensive one. Paragraph 3 of the instructions given to Admiral Vosky, at that time Russian Secretary of the Navy, ordered the Russian fleet in case of war to attack the enemy's commercial shipping and their colonies so as to cause them the greatest possible damage. The presence of the Russian Navy helped the Union enforce a devastating naval blockade against the southern states, which denied them access to critical supplies from Europe. It was not that these ships single-handedly kept the French and English vessels at bay. The fact that neither France nor England at that time wanted to risk becoming involved in an open war with the United States and Russia led them to be extremely cautious with overt military aid to the south. Without the effect of the presence of the Russian fleet, the course of the Civil War could have been significantly different. So Alexander II sends a Russian fleet to Alexandria, Virginia, blocks the ships coming into the south and blocks the southern ships from going to Europe. Sends another fleet over to San Francisco. And by so doing, sends a warning to the French in Mexico and sends a warning to the Confederates on the eastern seaboard. We as Russians are here to fight on the side of Abraham Lincoln and the North. And if you come at the Union, then you have become the enemies of Russia as well. So Alexander II, as the leader of Russia, stood in the way of the Jesuits' attempt to bottle up and strangle the Union and Abraham Lincoln. Alexander II did something else. He was about ready to establish a constitution in Russia. Can you imagine that? He's going to establish a constitution? I read in the book Vatican Assassins, page 376. And this is taken from the book by Arno Gabelian, Conflict of the Ages, page 85. It says, Alexander II had progressed well with his great reforms and had attached his signature to a constitution to be adopted by Russia. Now, what do you think happened to Alexander II? He fought on the side of the Union against the Jesuits in the South and the French and the English in the Civil War. He proposed a constitution for Russia. What do you think happened to him? He was taken out of the way. Gabelian's book, he says, the next day, after signing into law a constitution for Russia, the next day, a bomb was thrown at his carriage, which killed and wounded a number of Cossacks. I believe the word Cossack means a Russian troop. Oh, horse-mounted cavalry, okay? Who accompanied the Tsar's carriage. Alexander II, in deep sympathy, left the carriage to look at the dying men when a second bomb blew him to pieces. Oh, great. Thanks, Donna. So not only had Alexander I died by poison, Alexander II, in around 1882, was when Alexander II was blown into eternity. Two Russian czars dared to oppose the plans of the Jesuit order for Russia, and that's what they got for it. They were both killed. At this very time, in this very same historic setting, there was a man in the United States by the name of Albert Pike, Albert Pike was the sovereign grand commander of the ancient and accepted Scottish rite of Freemasonry. Albert Pike was the leading Illuminist in America. Now, as you and I have found, the Illuminati was a front organization for the Jesuit order. So Albert Pike, as an Illuminist, was right in line, right in harmony with the plans of the Jesuits. Yes. He was the sovereign grand commander and the top Illuminist in America. In 1871, this would be 11 years before the death of Alexander II. This is what Albert Pike had to say. I want you to think about this for a minute. He made this statement in 1871. That's 43 years before the First World War. This is what he said. Albert Pike stated that the First World War was to be fomented in order to destroy Tsarist Russia and to place that vast land under the direct control of Illuminati agents. Russia was then to be used as a boogeyman to further the aims of the Illuminati worldwide. "43 years before World War I, Albert Pike stated that the Jesuits, the Illuminati, were going to destroy Tsarist Russia. And as a result of that war, they would place Russia under the control of Illuminati agents or Jesuits. Then Russia was then to be used as a boogeyman to further the aims of the Illuminati worldwide. Why would the Jesuit order want to destroy Tsarist Russia? Tsarist Russia had stood in their way for world government in 1814. Tsarist Russia had expelled the Jesuits from their dominions in 1820. Tsarist Russia had protected the Greek or Russian Orthodox Church. And so it was decided 43 years before World War I, before the first shot was fired, it was determined 43 years in advance that Tsarist Russia was to be destroyed. Do the Jesuits and the Illuminati have long-range plans? You bet they do. They've planned things years in advance before things ever happen. That, of course, was taken from the book Descent into Slavery by Des Griffin. Now, all the time this is going on, the Jesuits and the Illuminati are plotting the destruction of Russia through World War I. They're plotting the destruction of Tsar Alexander II. It was at that time that a little church in the United States was starting up in the late 1800s, mid to late 1800s. Can you think of the name of that church? The Seventh-day Adventist Church. And we read in a book called True Witness, the story of Seventh-day Adventists in the Soviet Union by Merit Sapietz. It's a very good book. Very interestingly, I talked with a gentleman who was born in Siberia. He was born in basically a Russian concentration camp. That's where he was born. And I spoke with him for about an hour on Thursday. Yes, his dad, this gentleman I spoke to last Thursday, his dad had been sent to Siberia, and his dad was there for, I believe he said, 18 years. And his dad was there because his dad refused to take up weapons to fight in war. And so he was put in a Siberia concentration camp for, I think it was 18 years. And some of what was written in this book, he did not exactly collaborate, which I found very interesting. He didn't quite agree with everything that was in this book. In 1856, on page 21 of this book, The True Witness, Seventh-day Adventists started working among German immigrants in America. And the German immigrants in America who were converted to the Advent message began to send materials to their relatives over in Germany. And those relatives also began to send materials to German relatives who were living in the Ukraine in Western Russia. This was in the 1850s, 1860s. By the 1870s, the Bible became available throughout Russia. This was during the time of Alexander II. Bibles were available in all the main towns because of the work of the British and Foreign Bible Society. By 1882, the very year that Alexander II was blown into eternity, the first Seventh-day Adventist was converted in the Soviet Union. The man's name was Gerhard Park. Gerhard Park had been converted to Adventism through the literature that had been sent over there. And he began spreading literature throughout Russia in that very same year of 1882. By 1887, a year before the famous Minneapolis conference with Jones and Wagner, Gerhard Park had to leave Russia because Lutheran pastors were telling authorities that many Lutherans were becoming Seventh-day Adventists. And that was against the law. In 1890, it became very, very clear that no native Russians could become Seventh-day Adventists without facing prison sentences. Many Russians went to prison at that time because they did become Seventh-day Adventists. By 1900, when the Omega was ripping apart the Seventh-day Adventist Church in North America, there were 28 Seventh-day Adventist churches in Russia with over 1,000 members. By 1905, Nicholas II, the last czar that Russia ever had, issued an edict of toleration, giving people freedom of conscience, speech, assembly, and also freedom of religion. 1919, in 1917, Tsar Nicholas and his family were all killed. Even Anastasia. All of the Tsar's family were murdered. And we read again in the book Descent into Slavery, page 38. Albert Pike stated the First World War was to be fomented in order to destroy Tsarist Russia and to place that vast land under the direct control of Illuminati agents. Who was Nikolai Lenin working for? Who was Nikolai Lenin working for? Who was Joseph Stalin working for? Who was Nikita Khrushchev working for? They were working for the Jesuits of Rome. And so they allowed the Jesuit order officially back into Russia in 1922. It was also at this time, right around 1920, that there were 3 young people in a place called Fatima in a country called Portugal. And they declared that they had seen a vision of the Virgin Mary. And the Virgin Mary had told them that one thing they were to pray for was the conversion of Russia to her Immaculate Heart. And so with that vision of these demonic spirits with these 3 young people, you had all of Catholic Europe rising up to see the conversion of Russia. So Illuminati, Jesuit agents, Lenin, Stalin, Khrushchev, they take over Russia. And what was the result? By 1928, from 1919 through 1928, much evangelism went on in Russia under Lenin. By that time, there were 600 Seventh-day Adventist churches and over 13,000 members. But in 1928, 4 years after the rise of Joseph Stalin into power, another law was passed restricting religious freedom, forcing armed service in the military, registering of all churches, evangelism was banned, and people had to go to work and children had to go to school on the Sabbath. That's very interesting. There have been 2 issues in the 20th century that divided Seventh-day Adventists in Russia. One was over working and going to school on the Sabbath. In Russia, the Sabbath was a common working day. And so people were to work on that day and the children were to be in school. Also, another issue that divided Seventh-day Adventists in Russia in the 20th century was over our stance in times of war. Some Seventh-day Adventists said that we should take up arms and fight and kill other people. Other Seventh-day Adventists in Russia said that no, we are conscientious objectors. We will serve, but we will serve in the medical fields. We will heal instead of destroy. And so those 2 issues divided Seventh-day Adventists in Russia in the 20th century. In fact, a little note for you all. How many of you remember a leader in Russia by the name of Michael Kulikov? You remember that guy's name? You have. I was talking with this gentleman last Thursday who was born and raised in Russia, whose dad served in a Siberian concentration camp for 18 years. And I asked him, I said, did Michael Kulikov, as a Seventh-day Adventist leader in Russia, did he tell Seventh-day Adventists to work and go to school on the Sabbath? Or did he tell them to keep the Sabbath come what may? He said he told Seventh-day Adventists to work on Sabbath and for children to go to school on Sabbath. I asked him, I said, is it true that Michael Kulikov, as a Seventh-day Adventist leader in Russia, told Seventh-day Adventist young people that they were to take up arms and kill other people? He said, that's true. Michael Kulikov was not working for God's people. Michael Kulikov was working for the Soviet agents, the Jesuits in Russia. From the time of Joseph Stalin's decree in 1928, all the way down till the time when Mikhail Gorbachev started perestroika in the 1980s, many Seventh-day Adventists in Russia were arrested, many were imprisoned, and many died in exile. Many thousands of Seventh-day Adventists were arrested, imprisoned, and died in places like Siberia and other places as well. Stalin, Khrushchev, Leonid Brezhnev, all of these men persecuted God's people. And when those efforts did not work to completely wipe out the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Russia, then they used unconverted men, who I tragically say, like Michael Kulikov, to push Seventh-day Adventists to break God's law. From Edmund Perry's book, page 384, Edmund Perry says this in his book, The Secret History of the Jesuits, page 124, says, "The Russian Revolution, by eliminating the Tsar, the protector of the Orthodox Church, had it not decapitated the great rival and helped the penetration of the Roman Church? 1 century after their expulsion by Tsar Alexander I, the Jesuits would again undertake the conquest of the Slavic world. With the death of the Tsar and the rise of Jesuit agents, Lenin, Stalin, and so on, the Jesuit order would seek to destroy the Orthodox Church and every Protestant church in Russia." We read from another book, Arno Gabelian's book, Conflict of the Ages, page 103 to 106. It says, under the reigns of Lenin and then with Stalin, 1.7 million victims were killed. Nearly 5,000 of them were priests, teachers, and nuns of the Greek Orthodox Church. But then the persecution extended to the millions of Lutherans, Reformed, Baptists, Methodists, and especially Mennonite Christians. 100,000 Lutherans banished in semi-starvation in Siberia. Perhaps the greatest sufferers as Christians have been the Mennonites. What horrible sufferings, torture, and death these good people have passed through. Whole villages were wiped out. And today, hundreds of them are confined in miserable prison camps, suffering untold agonies. In the wilds of Siberia and the far north, hundreds of others, banished ones, are still living enslaved, deprived of all the needed simple comforts of life, degraded and half-starved. Thousands of churches of the different branches have been demolished. And the work of destruction goes on, so that, as stated before, by 1937, not a single church building or meeting house is left. And the circulation of the Bible is not only strictly forbidden, but punishable with exile. What's that? Well, I'll tell you, Ray, it went on for decades. Decades. The 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and into the early 80s. We're talking about 25 years ago. In fact, in this book right here, True Witness, she tells about a man by the name of Vladimir Shelkov. Vladimir Shelkov is what we would call today a Reformed Seventh-day Adventist. Some of their ideas I do not agree with, but nevertheless, Vladimir Shelkov in the 70s and 80s was imprisoned in Russia because he would spread Seventh-day Adventist literature in the Soviet Union, because he taught people to keep the Sabbath, and he taught people not to take up arms in times of war. Vladimir Shelkov ended up dying in prison at the age of 83. At the very time that Vladimir Shelkov was on trial and then imprisoned in Russia for his religious convictions, Michael Kulikov was coming to America at General Conference sessions telling Seventh-day Adventists that people in Russia were free to worship God according to the dictates of their own conscience. Michael Kulikov? I believe he worked for them, Ray, yes. Absolutely. Yes. Yep. See, the thing that I saw in this book, True Witness, I saw the very same thing happening in Russia that has happened in America. And see, in Russia, you see, they persecuted those who were standing for their faith, those who were registered with the government. Everything worked out fine for them. But those who were in the denomination or in the structure in Russia, they began to give up their religious convictions. They'd work on Sabbath. They'd take arms in times of war. They stopped doing evangelism and preaching the Advent message. And then you have another group in Russia during those awful years. They were preaching the message. They would create underground printing presses that were illegal. And they would print Spirit of Prophecy books. And they would spread them out across Russia. And the people would be imprisoned and exiled. And they died in prison camps in Russia simply for printing Spirit of Prophecy books. Those are the heroes. If you want to talk about a hero of the 20th century, those are heroes. Not Dirty Harry Truman or Franklin Roosevelt or Ronald Reagan, who sends an ambassador to to Rome. They're not heroes. Not Michael Jordan or any of these other people. The heroes of the 20th century are these folk of these Russian Seventh-day Adventist Christians who were willing to go to prison and to exile and to die for their faith. Those are the heroes of the 20th century. It's very, very clear, as we read from Albert Pike in Descent into Slavery on page 38, that Lenin, Stalin, Khrushchev, all of these people were Illuminati agents. They were told what to do by the Jesuit order, and they carried out the Jesuits' program for Russia through nearly all of the 20th century. I want to read to you who it was who financed Lenin, Stalin, Khrushchev, and the like. It says this. This is from G. Edward Griffin's book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, page 264 and 265. It says, on March 23rd, 1917, a mass meeting was held at Carnegie Hall to celebrate the abdication of Nicholas II, which meant the overthrow of the Tsarist rule in Russia. The following day, there appeared on page 2 of the New York Times a telegram from Jacob Schiff, which had been read to this audience. He expressed regrets that he had not been able to attend the mass celebration the night before, and then described the successful Russian Revolution as what we had hoped and striven for these long years. In 1949, Jacob Schiff's grandson, John, was quoted in the New York Journal-American as saying that his grandfather had given $20 million for the triumph of communism in Russia. Jacob Schiff was sent to America by the Rothschilds of Europe. The Rothschilds used Jacob Schiff to gain control of Wall Street and the entire American financial system. The Jesuits controlled the Rothschilds, who controlled Jacob Schiff. Jacob Schiff was instrumental in creating the Federal Reserve System in America in 1913. The Jesuits, through Rothschild and Schiff, financed Lenin and Trotsky and the Bolshevik Revolution to create in Russia a boogeyman communist party. You see, folk, throughout the 20th century, we have been told that Russia was... What did Ronald Reagan call Russia? Do you remember? What did he call it? The evil empire. The evil empire. And who was America's enemy throughout the 20th century? Russia, or the Soviet Union. Through the last half of the 20th century, more or less, the Soviet Union was the great enemy of America. From 1945, basically. That's right. And if you go back and you analyze it, the same people that ruled America were the same people that ruled Russia. The Rothschilds, through the Federal Reserve System, controlled America through the 20th century. The Rothschilds controlled Russia through Lenin, Stalin, Khrushchev, and the like. America and Russia were not at war through the 20th century. There was no such thing as a Cold War. It was all fabricated so that America would go out on deeds of destruction. America always fought wars in the last 50 years of the 20th century to stop what? Communism. That's right. But folk, Vietnam, as we read from Avril Manhattan's book, Vietnam, Why Did We Go? It was not to fight communism. Vietnam was fought because the Catholic Church wanted to create a Catholic superpower in Southeast Asia to annihilate the Buddhists. That's why Vietnam was fought. Oh, yes. Yes, they were. That's right, Charlotte. That's right. That's why one of the reasons he was killed. That's exactly right. So, folk, the Cold War was a cold hoax. It was a lie. Because the same people that controlled America controlled Russia. And so they played it as though there was a war between the two in order for the papacy's enemies to be destroyed. And you see that in Korea. Korea failed, so they tried it in Vietnam. And there you have it. In closing this talk, I was fascinated with a story that this gentleman shared with me on the phone the other day. He said to me that in 1965, Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, had a speech in his October Palace, which is in Kiev, in the Ukraine. And Nikita Khrushchev put on his prophetic shoes during that speech that day, and he declared, he said, in 25 years, there will be no Bibles in the Soviet Union. He said, the only Bible that will exist in this great land will exist in a museum. Nikita Khrushchev said that in 1965. 25 years later, in 1990, a Seventh-day Adventist evangelist got up to speak in the exact same place, the October Palace, where Nikita Khrushchev had stood 25 years before. And at the end of that meeting that night, in 1990, that Seventh-day Adventist evangelist passed out 8,000 Bibles to people in the Soviet Union. The man who told me that knew because he stood next to that Seventh-day Adventist evangelist on the rostrum that night and helped him. I don't know. He didn't tell me the evangelist's name, Grim. So, folk, we can see through the course of history over the last 200-odd years how the Jesuit order of the Catholic Church has sought to destroy the truth of God in Russia. Through their agents, the Jesuits, then through Lenin and Stalin and other leaders. But the God of heaven has overruled, and He will continue to overrule until His work is finished in this earth. I want to close with this passage. It's in Psalm chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. And it says this, why do the heathen rage, and the people imagine a vain thing? The rulers of the earth take counsel together against the Lord and against His anointed, saying, let us break their bands asunder, and let us cast their cords from us. Then the Bible says, and he that sits in the heavens shall laugh. The Lord shall have them in derision. Then shall He speak to them in His wrath, and vex them in His